Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third class of our Bluegrass class for the Lifetime Learning Institute. This is week 3, Bluegrass Becomes a Genre, and which is just a little bit of bluegrass history, continuing our discussion from last week, last class. And we also today today's featured instrument is the fiddle, or the violin, and we're extremely fortunate to have Ambrose Vertibello to tell us and demonstrate all about the fiddle and the history of the fiddle and this kind of music. So, continuing on with the little introductory pieces that I've been doing about the history of bluegrass. Last class I mentioned that the Bill Monroe Band with Flatt and Scruggs inspired a host of other people to begin playing bluegrass. And music that wasn't called bluegrass yet, but it had a sound very similar to what Monroe was doing with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. And one of the earliest and most prominent were the Stanley Brothers of Virginia. They were a brother duet. They quickly adapted their sound to the hot new style that Monroe was featuring with Flatt and Scruggs. And let's hear a little bit of what they were doing in the, this was probably recorded in the early 50s. That vocal chorus that we just heard demonstrated an innovation that's generally credited to the Stanley Brothers. It's called the high baritone trio. It takes a normal bluegrass vocal trio, which is typically the melody in the middle with a harmony above and below, and takes the lower harmony, brings it up an octave, and puts it on top. That gives it kind of a spooky sound, and you heard it loud and clear on that chorus. So the Stanley Brothers, who started off kind of as not quite imitators, but very much in the Monroe mold, quickly began to look for ways to distinguish themselves from the Monroe sound. And one of the ways they did it was this vocal trio. Another way was just to write a lot of their own material. Carter Stanley, who's the guitar player in that band, was one of the great bluegrass songwriters and lead vocalists of all time. So Carter Stanley was a bluegrass boy for a brief period, so he worked with Monroe. Jimmy Martin was also one of Monroe's most famous guitar player and lead singers before he went out on his own. And he too, after his tenure with Monroe, ended up leading a band for many years. This is one of his more well-known numbers called The Parade of Love.
From what I've been hearing, you really got it made. You've got a colors on your lover's hit parade. And if I can be your number one, well, I don't know what I'll do. I want to be plumb up to the top. I'm so in love with you. On the hit parade of love, I know I'll never stop.
Again, Monroe inspired Jimmy Martin. Jimmy Martin learned a lot about bluegrass playing and singing from Monroe, but when he went out on his own, he quickly developed his own style, and a lot of these folks are very unmistakable. They don't sound like anybody else. They don't sound like Monroe. They don't sound like Flatt and Scruggs, who also formed their own highly successful band beginning in 1948 when they left Monroe. To people who have begun to listen to the music, it becomes the differences, I think, become more apparent. It's typical with all genre musics that as you begin to listen to it, you think, well, it all sounds the same. You know, the banjo kind of sounds the same, the vocals at high pitch sound the same. But the more you listen to it, the more it grows on you, the more you realize that there's a variety of stylistic elements that each artist brings or brought to the music that helps it change a little bit, grow and evolve, and that process is continuing right down to the present. Next one. Another Bill Monroe alum is the banjo playing half of the Osborne brothers, Sonny Osborne, who worked with Monroe when he was 14 years old, which pretty impressive, recorded and toured with him. And his brother Bobby, who is one of the great bluegrass mandolin virtuosos. This is something they did in the 60s, so it's a little after the time we're talking about, but it sort of shows, again, that the sound they were going for was very distinctive and not something that would be easily mistaken for other people's music.
And here are the Osborne brothers.
Up this hill and down, and up this hill again. Up this hill and down, and up this hill again. It's a mighty, mighty long road. What ain't got no end? Well, it's 5 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night. 5 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night.
It had almost a kind of a rockabilly sound to it. Definitely different from what Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs were doing, and what Monroe was doing when Sonny Osborne was playing banjo with him. Sonny, I should mention, is also one of the great banjo players of bluegrass. Another brother duet that got its start around the time we're talking about, the late 40s and early 50s, were Jim and Jesse McReynolds and the Virginia Boys. Jim and Jesse were, in a sense, a bit of a throwback because they really focused on their duet harmony, brother duet. Jesse sang the leads and played the mandolin, and Jim played the guitar and sang the tenor part. And again, very distinctive sound that they don't sound like anybody else, so let's have a little bit of them. I think the duet harmony they had was just lovely. A really beautiful sounding duet, and instrumentally they were distinguished by Jesse McReynolds' mandolin style, which was featured a technique called cross picking, which is a little different from Monroe. It gave it more of a banjo-y sound, and Jesse became the master of that style of playing, and that, together with that beautiful harmony that we just heard, sort of is the hallmark of their very distinctive sound. So, I guess in sum, by the early 50s, you had a number of groups that were working very loosely in the mold that Monroe had set, but each one bringing something new and distinct to the music and helping it to grow and advance in different directions. And it's not surprising, I guess, that these bands, which included Lester Flatt, Earl Scruggs, and the Foggy Mountain Boys, Jimmy Martin, Carter Stanley, the Stanley Brothers, and the Osborne Brothers, all included people who'd played with Monroe. So they got the music from Bill firsthand. So that concludes my portion of the program today. Now we are extremely fortunate to hear about the fiddle, the violin, from one of its foremost proponents in the Hudson Valley, a longtime friend of mine, and as you will see, an incredibly knowledgeable musician, wonderful player, and somebody who will, I think, present an incredibly rewarding and informative program on the fiddle. Ambrose Vertibello. Please make Ambrose welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I want to thank Lynn Lipton and Mike Foley, and of course Andy, for all the work, and the man behind the camera, my old friend Fred Robbins, for all the work that they do to make these classes happen. My pitch today will be how the violin, because really there's no difference between a violin and a fiddle. All recognize this thing, right? There's no difference. How it fits into the bluegrass style of music. And in order to do that, I thought it might make sense to talk about the history, like how it evolved from the earliest bluegrass bands, and also what it was like even before bluegrass was quote unquote invented. So we'll talk a little bit about the early fiddling, and I thought the best person I could think of, if I were to pick a single historical musician to try to illustrate that, would be a man by the name of Arthur Smith, a Tennessee musician. He was born in the late 1890s, and he lived until I think 1971. And he was extremely influential in at least sort of creating the basic techniques, the basic approach to playing the violin or the fiddle that then became the sort of the starting point for bluegrass fiddling. And I don't want to suggest that Arthur Smith is the be-all and end-all of bluegrass fiddling, because in fact the techniques and the styles evolved well beyond him. But there are a couple of interesting things about Arthur Smith that you should know. One is that some of the fiddlers I'm going to be talking about all cite him as a strong influence. These are early fiddlers. So music is not a static thing. It's fluid. He was influenced by them as well as he influencing them. That's something that you always have to remember. I mean, I think we all know we play together, we pick up things from each other, we steal things from each other. And Arthur Smith, though, was cited by many great players, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There are several ways, though, that I think that his influence can be compartmentalized. One is to be an influence, you have to be known, you have to be heard, you have to be well established. And he was very well established because he was the main fiddler on a radio show that I'm sure you've all heard of, called the Grand Ole Opry. So we know the Grand Ole Opry now is this sort of museum piece in Nashville. It started out as a radio show, and he was the fiddler, and he played and he recorded, so he was known through his recording. So there's that practical aspect. In order to influence, you have to be out there. He also had a technical influence on the instrument. He played very strongly. He played much faster than anybody. I mean, I don't know people today who play as fast as Arthur Smith, and that'll be one of the first things that we talk about here. And bluegrass has sort of evolved beyond just playing things at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But if you're a good bluegrass band, you can play at 1,000,000 miles an hour, at least a tune now and then, so to sort of establish your chops. And Arthur Smith, nobody could play faster than he. In the 1940s, Arthur Smith and the McGee brothers, the Dixie-Liners, traveled around with Bill Monroe. Andy was talking about the father of bluegrass music. And it might be too formal to say that they toured. They barnstormed. They traveled around. They played concerts together, barbecues, church picnics, etc. And I can just imagine Bill Monroe listening to Arthur Smith playing at 158 beats per minute, which is fast, and realizing that if he was going to go up on stage after this guy, he'd better have some bullets in his holster. And so and I think that aspect of bluegrass playing, while as I said, doesn't apply to every bluegrass song. There's plenty of slow ones and plenty of waltzes. He did have that effect pretty clearly. The other thing, the way that Arthur Smith was very influential, other than the technical things, the speed, the double stops, the strong tone, was that he was a composer, and he wrote a lot of songs, and those songs have become very much part of the bluegrass repertoire. And we'll go through some of that stuff, and as we go through it, I'll sort of point out some of these tunes that are played even today. When we go a little further into the pitch, I'm going to be concentrating on three of the early players. other than Arthur Smith, who were bluegrass players. One is Howdy Forster, really one of the first players with Bill Monroe. He joined Monroe in 1940. He was a teenager at the time. Chubby Wise, who was the fiddle player when Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt were in the band. So that was sort of considered to be the classic first bluegrass band, because it had the sound of the Earl Scruggs 5-string banjo that we're all familiar with. And then the third fiddler is Kenny Baker. Now, Kenny Baker and Howdy Forster made a recording together in the early 1980s, I think it was, or late 70s. This is, 40 or 50 years after Arthur Smith had his heyday. And so I bought this record back then. It was, piece of vinyl. You remember those? So I remember when I was doing this, these slides, I pulled out that recording. There's 14 tunes on that. It's all instrumental. One medley and then the other 12 selections. And I counted 7 Arthur Smith related songs, either ones that he composed or the ones that he played first, or recorded first. So just if you can imagine having that influence as an artist, that 50 years hence, 2 of the main fiddle players in all of bluegrass used half of their material from you. I think that's a good indication. Okay, let's zip through this. I wanted to go very quickly. We're going to get some sound clips that hopefully you don't need to hear me talk. We'll be listening to stuff. But I wanted to give you at least an idea of some of the main early fiddle players. This is not exhaustive, but these are people that if you look up, and which I couldn't do when I was growing up learning to play.
When did the word fiddle come to replace the word violin?
It was actually, we're talking about 500 years ago. The word fiddle, F-I-D-L, was used back then. And I think that what's happened over time is that fiddle has come to mean a folk style of playing, and violin, the entire range. I mean, some people still call, I was in Cape Breton last week, and my wife bought me a book about Cape Breton musicians and interviews, and there was one of the musicians who was interviewed did not like the idea of the violin being called a fiddle. She felt it was disrespectful. And yet I've heard Itzhak Perlman referred to his $4 million Stradivarius as a fiddle. So I can't really tell you when. So these players here are all very, very well-known old-time players. This is pre-bluegrass. So they all contributed to bluegrass, because bluegrass is a melting pot, as I think you've probably figured out already. There's the folk song tradition, there's the Afro-American influence, there's the fiddle tune tradition, all these things getting mixed up. You can't deny the impact of ragtime music, early jazz, popular music of the day, and it took a little bit of everything. And so these fiddle players each had an aspect of their music showing up in bluegrass later on. And Clark Kessinger, one of the most well-known early old-time players, Clayton McMission, who played Skilled Lickers, probably the most popular band of the late 1920s, early 30s. Okay, go again. So now we're going to get into the bluegrass part of the program. So Howdy Forster was, he started with Monroe as a teenager, and he went into the armed services in 1940, late 42 or early 43, and has said on many occasions that he was heavily influenced by Arthur Smith, fellow Tennessean, and just a beautiful, beautiful player. We're going to find a little later on, we're going to play little snippets of some of the tunes that he's associated with, and you'll get a sense of what a great musician he was. The record that I mentioned earlier that he made with Kenny Baker, That's called Red Apple Rag is the name of that record. He wasn't at the top of his game there. He was battling cancer. He had a serious operation. He came back and passed on only a year after that. So that recording, while his playing is still excellent, it doesn't really show him at his top. So I just wanted to point that out to you if you do go to listen to him. But some of the cuts we're going to listen to later will really, I think, reflect his ability. In fact, those are the tunes there that we'll listen to a little later on. Chubby Wise, as I said, is extremely important fiddle player because he played when Monroe had Earl Scruggs in the band. So he kind of gets associated, he's sort of on the Mount Rushmore of bluegrass musicians because he was in that band. Interesting thing about Chubby Wise was, though, he was a little bit older than Howdy Forster, even though Howdy predated him in the band. He came from a popular music tradition. He played a lot of Western swing music, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but sort of a string version of early jazz with some cowboy and folk influences, but very swingy. And he also had a lot of influences from pop culture, and he also, after he left Monroe, he did some very, very nice gospel recordings. Just to give you an idea that the music it really is a melting pot. Kenny Baker, considered to be the best bluegrass fiddle player. I think so. There's maybe people who are a little flashier, but his musicianship is impeccable, and anybody who's heard him, any fiddle player who's heard him, realizes that you have quite a steep uphill climb to become anywhere near his ability. The reason I've got two photos up there is that the one without the hat is so that his mother would recognize him. He always wore a cowboy hat. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of Kenny Baker where he didn't have a cowboy hat. But just a terrific musician and great longevity, as you can see. He started with Monroe in the 1950s, but he left the band for a while. But when he finally came back in the 60s, he stayed. And they composed many tunes together. Just a terrific player. You'll be hearing some of his tunes. Very, very much a.
Sorry.
That's okay. Very much an Arthur Smith aficionado. So, now I just wanted to very quickly before we get into the sound clips. Here's some names that I don't expect you to memorize these, but if you can, it's okay. Some of these folks we're going to be listening to, we'll be listening to a little bit of Bobby Hicks and Byron Berline. I believe Joe Meadows is playing on the Stanley Brothers cut later on. And then down here, more recent players. And some of these players are still out there making noise and doing a great job. Let's see the next. So now we're up to the hero of the day, Arthur Smith. Now this is Sam and Kirk McGee playing guitar and banjo over there. And as I said, these guys were the Rolling Stones of the 1930s, late 20s and 1930s. You have to put yourself in a position of the country at that time. We know about the Great Depression. We know that people didn't have money. We know that they entertained themselves in a local fashion. They weren't going to concerts in New York City. They weren't. They didn't have television. They did have record players, but everybody had a radio, which is even more prevalent. And as I said, based on the fame of these guys through the Grand Ole Opry, they became very well known, very influential. But you'll hear that their style of playing is not like a bluegrass style. the instruments that back up the fiddle kind of form just sort of a background, but not there's not much interplay, and that's one difference. But what we're going to be listening to here is really the fiddle, and we're going to be talking about some of the fiddle aspects that Arthur Smith brought in. It's another picture. This is much later. I think this is a picture of when Mike Seeger got the Dixie-Liners to perform again. So this is a picture 30 years after the one that you saw on the first foil. So I've talked a little bit about this sort of thing in terms of his fiddle style, that he played very fast. He liked to have these little bluesy things in his playing. He was really one of the first ones to do that. A lot of double stops, but not double stops in the way we think of modern fiddling, where the double stops kind of move around and move into each other, but they were more as punctuation.
What's a double stop?
A double stop is when you play more than one note at a time. So there's two notes at a time. So versus. Okay. Now, what Arthur Smith would do is he'd be playing a song, and you hear a double stop sort of as a punctuation. Whereas later on in bluegrass, what you'd hear is the double stops would move between each other, you know. Okay, that sort of thing. He didn't do any of that stuff. But just getting the double stops out there and getting people to hear them, I think, was part of his importance, that he got people thinking in that way, you know, ways to make the fiddle louder, ways to make it more vibrant, more important in the context of the song or the tune. The variations that he did play variations, but they were very limited. He did not go crazy. Whereas if you listen to modern, or not even modern bluegrass, but starting really with like around the time of Chubby Wise, Chubby and fiddlers following him would play these intricate little passages that only would hint at the melody. They would also do other sorts of variations where they might just play a little tiny motif just to fill in a little bit of space between the verses in a song. The use of the fiddle as a rhythm instrument was also not really an Arthur Smith thing, but started more with Monroe, and the fiddle was used to mimic what Monroe was doing on the mandolin. And what Monroe was doing was he was playing where the guitar would strum. So the guitar rhythmically would play a downbeat on a bass note and then a strum on the upbeat. 1, 2, 1, 2. And what Monroe started doing with his mandolin playing is he would play on that 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. And you have a really percussive, sharp sound. Well, on the fiddle, you can do the same thing. You play near the bow, down here, and where there's a little bit more tension in the hair, and you can do. So you can make a metronome out of your fiddle also. So he did not, that was not his thing. As I said, there was not an interplay of instruments, plus Arthur Smith tended to be the lead player, so he had to be playing. Now, he did do a lot of songs with the McGee brothers, but I'm really going to mainly be talking about his repertoire as an instrumental player. Tons of rags, blues, fiddle tunes, and plus things that he wrote. We're going to go into those. Songs, he wrote Pig in a Pen. I know it doesn't sound like serious music, but it's a fun song. It's done even today. In the Pines, a beautiful folk song, and a number of others. He's associated with, he's one of the first players that played Orange Blossom Special, which I refer to in the pitch as OBS, because I don't want to say Orange Blossom Special. It's just too much. And but actually, so in talking about the interplay and the exchange of ideas, Chubby Wise is one of the composers of that tune. So he sort of influenced his mentor, Arthur Smith, and Arthur Smith did play that tune. Chubby played that tune, obviously he wrote it, he and Irvin Rausch, in a very, very similar way. If you go onto YouTube, look up Scotty Stoneman, okay? Remember that, Scotty Stoneman? One of the first fiddlers I ever heard that made me go. And he does a version of Orange Blossom Special on Roy on Porter Wagner's show. It's just ridiculous. And other sorts of tunes where the fiddle is making some sort of sound, recreating an environment. You know, in the 1930s, you were an entertainer. Maybe you were a musician. You were an entertainer first, so you had to do these things. Lost Train Blues is really just a precursor to Orange Blossom Special. We've got some sort of harmonic whistling, and listen to the Mockingbird. The fiddle is mimicking the sound of birds. So let's see what we got next here. So here's some of the things that you want to listen to while we're going through our sound things. When we get into the advanced bluegrass players, you'll be hearing more interesting double stops. The improvisational variations will be more interesting. Arthur didn't really play with much vibrato. It's very, very basic kind of vibrato. The fills and flourishes are a modern thing, meaning after 1948 or something. And the hardest thing to describe really is this last one, the role of the violin or the fiddle in the band. And this really, you can almost educate yourselves. You listen to the music and you can hear the different things. Like you can hear that it's doing the double stops, or you can hear that it's doing those rhythmic chops, or you can hear that it's playing some sort of a background fill over a vocalist, hopefully not getting in the way. Okay. So even though there are those modern things, there's still the basic part. You can't go backwards, can you?
Can't.
Okay. We'll have to get you a new computer. So even though those are the main things I want you to be listening for stylistically, just remember that bluegrass music is really vocal music. Even though Bill Monroe wrote a whole bunch of fiddle tunes, and bluegrass was influenced by all the fiddle tunes that came over from Ireland and England, and some from Germany, that still it's really vocal music. And I think that if you keep that in mind, you have a leg up on understanding the role of the violin, because the violin is very much a vocal kind of instrument. It recreates the human voice. You know, you've got the ability to do vibrato. You can't really do that as well, at least on any other instrument in the bluegrass band. It's a loud, clearly heard instrument. You can establish the melody very easily with the violin. The guitar isn't as loud as the Martin guitars were. You can't really, until the advent of good microphones and good sound system, you really couldn't hear what the guitar was doing. It was really just there as background. So the violin, you could have the vibrato that would mimic the human voice, or you could establish. You could easily make the melody heard, and in the early days, melody, and it still is really the most important thing in bluegrass and country music. You get too fancy, you lose half your audience, I feel.
Ambrose, did I interject?
Yeah.
Chubby Wise did a fiddle workshop at a bluegrass festival I was at years ago. This was in the 90s, so Chubby was 50 years after he played with Monroe. And he and Joe Meadows, who was another fiddle player that I think you mentioned, had some wisdom to share with us, and the wisdom was play the words. They both
Perfect.
said that.
I love that.
Play the words.
I hadn't heard that
You're
one.
singing with the fiddle.
Yeah, so that really does should establish in your minds the prime role
Were all of these early fiddlers self-taught, or did any of them have any of the classical?
Some did, yes, some did have lessons. I think well, folk music had to be, self-taught. And in fact, many cases they were taught by usually their mother or father or older brother would show them stuff. But there's just as many stories where they steal the fiddle that they're told not to touch. And, and someday they're outed and they start playing and everybody's there, holy cow, how did you do that? And it's because they were sneaking the fiddle out occasionally. But, okay, we're gonna listen to some music now. Arthur Smith, he's one fast fiddle player. So let's listen to that. This is I could try to play that for you, but then I'd break out into sweat. But it's just an example of, if you could imagine Bill Monroe listening to that, and thinking, "Oh my God, they're not going to like me anymore if I get up and just do my old, Bill and Charlie tunes." So anyway, let's listen to. Bill didn't do that tune, but he did a tune that I don't think he would have written if he hadn't heard Arthur Smith.
I noticed one of the things is sliding up into a note.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So he does that's almost directly from Arthur Smith, because you'll hear that he liked to do these little slides into into a note that was nothing too crazy. The last clip I wanted to play was from two of my favorite fiddle players. One, Bobby Hicks, actually played with Monroe a little bit before Kenny Baker, but they played together in Monroe's band for a while, and they also had made some recordings. So there's an example of this tune with the two fiddle treatment. An example can be used by these particular tunes. Early bluegrass was not harmonically complicated music. What set it apart was that it was exciting music, or it was fast, it was very rhythmic, and it was accessible, and it was for dancing, it was for partying. So that's something you should also keep in mind. So next we're going to go into the sort of the blues area of fiddle playing, which we'll start with yet another Arthur Smith tune, and then we're going to have a couple of different versions behind it. One is by Chubby Wise. First we'll hear Arthur's version, then we'll listen to Chubby. And the interesting thing about these versions is that you'll hopefully hear a little bit of the pop influence in Chubby's playing, and maybe more later on in some of the other examples. And in Vassar's case, you're going to hear more of the improvisational aspects. Doesn't really exist in Arthur's straight ahead iconic version of the tune. So let's hear Arthur first and get an idea. Chubby. melodically pretty much the same, but there's different sense to it there. And bluegrass is not a one-dimensional type of music. There's all kinds of different tempos and rhythms that will show up there. And I think what you're hearing a little bit there is a little extra bluesy inflections, a little bit swingier. That's Chubby Wise. Then, in terms of improvisation, one of the greatest improvisational fiddle players was Vassar Clemens, and we'll hear his version of that. Okay, so it wasn't too much improvisation there, but if we were allowed to play these clips a little longer, you would have been impressed. Take my word for it. It's easy to find these clips, so you can do a little investigation yourself, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Well, that's another one, actually. If you want to play that one.
Oh, go. Okay, I can do it.
So Vassar made a solo record called Crossing the Catskills, where he did, this is a little bit later version of Florida Blues, which was Lynn started playing, if she can play it again. We can go on, it's okay.
Okay.
Take my word for it, it's very improvisational, very, very wild playing. And the reason, what I wanted to illustrate there was that Arthur Smith, while establishing the basic tune, bluegrass fiddling evolved well beyond that, and that the kind of improvisations he did, the kind of variations I would even call them, not improvisations, were very, very limited, whereas bluegrass fiddling became known as a style of music that the fiddle player could really stretch out on. And I say that even though I don't back off my earlier statement that really melody's the first thing. They establish the melody, and then they play to the back row then. So a peacock rag we've got a bunch of examples of peacock rag. Rags were important in Arthur Smith's time because it just shows that he was playing music from all parts of his environment, and rags were, the rag in the early jazz era was still very strong. So let's hear Arthur Smith's version of Peacock Rag. So he's doing a little raggy thing at the end of that, in that B part. So that's something that you sort of hear in, in Dixieland, that kind of thing. And the first part of this tune it's really the same chord progression as San Antonio Rose, right? But let's hear Chubby. You really get a sense of Chubby's Western swing influences in this version of Peacock Rag.
What makes something a rag?
For one thing, it's typically wouldn't be played as fast as those breakdown tunes. It'd be a little slower, a little more, rhythmic. But what happened, that definition kind of went out the window when bluegrass really took over the rags, because what you'll hear as you go through these rags is you'll hear some of them played, you know, faster than any breakdown that you'll ever come across. So what happened was that the initial song was a reg, and but people will take it, modify it a little bit, so that it fits into what they consider to be the bluegrass type of approach to the music, which is a faster approach. The you know, there's I think that when we look at any of these songs, if I tell you that a rag is has a slightly slower tempo, and if you listen to any of those, you'd call me a liar, because you know, a lot of them aren't slower, and that's because rag was, you know, the initial type of song, usually also the initial type of song that then kind of evolved into this showpiece. But rags would often have slightly more involved harmonies. So you'd hear chords being played that weren't typically the 1-4-5 chords, the three chord songs. You'd hear substitute chords, and you'd hear more improvisation that was outside the bound of you know, typical diatonic harmony. So that's the main difference. It's the reason rags show up a lot in bluegrass music is they're a little bit more advanced to play harmonically, and musicians need to be challenged. So, you know, you could just play, you know, the old 3-chord and a cloud of dust type songs, but you might not keep your musicians happy. So people would bring in songs that were getting more and more complicated. And if you follow the evolution of bluegrass to the modern day, the statement I made about it being a harmonically simple music is not really applicable anymore. Bluegrass has become more and more harmonically rich as younger virtuosic musicians become you know, integrated into the style. And you know, back then, the way that you were harmonically more interesting was you played rags.
While you've been saying that, I can't get this out of my brain. I keep thinking, what would a bluegrass band do to Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, for example?
I don't know. That's, you know, that's another tangent of music. You know, I mean, his music was so complex and so rich. What we're going to find when we listen to Arthur Smith's rags, they're fairly straightforward harmonically, even though they're maybe a little bit more complicated than a typical folk song. When we get down to Howdy Forster's Wild Fiddler's rag, which we're probably only going to hear a little snippet of, it's quite a tour de force of you know, harmonic variation, and it's technically very, very difficult to play. But let's listen to Chubby Wise. You'll hear some of his Western swing influence, I think, on this particular
So
work.
I think because I went backwards, we're going to listen to Arthur Smith
Okay.
first, again. Chubby?
I didn't say anything about Byron Berline. Maybe I should.
Yeah.
So he was one of the first fiddle players I ever heard. He's an Oklahoma player. Plays in what's usually referred to as a Texas style. Very clear, very beautiful sound. Old time more than bluegrass, but the first record I heard him on was with a bluegrass band called the Dillards, and they played these old time Texas fiddle tunes in a bluegrass style. And I've never recovered, actually. So, but Byron Berline does a version of Peacock Rag where he just goes light years beyond the two versions you just heard. So Red Apple Rag is the tune that's named after that record that I mentioned that Howdy and Kenny did. So let's hear Arthur's version of that first. Kenny? So one of the things to notice there is that there's a greater separation in the instruments. You can hear the five-string banjo, you hear the bass going. You don't hear any of that. Obviously, there's no finger-picked banjo. It's usually clawhammer type in the Arthur Smith stuff generally. And then we have Aubrey Haney, one of the best of the current crop of players, and he just does a great job on this tune. Hear that chop? Quite a bit faster also. I think in the next example, Smith's Rag, obviously written by Arthur Smith, I think Aubrey actually might play it a little bit slower than Arthur. So let's hear those. Again, listen to the background. Not a very complicated harmonically. Aubrey. A little slower, as I said. He does a sort of interesting thing. You know, Arthur Smith's double stops are strictly on the chord according to how the song is going. So Aubrey puts in this sort of funny double stop that you really wonder, like, where did that come from? It doesn't really sound exactly right, but it sounds great. So I could put it. Anyway, but finally, Wild Fiddler's Rag, one of Howdy Forrester's compositions that sort of reintroduces the rag complexity that we were sort of talking about a minute ago, and let's hear that. I'd play that for you, but I'd hurt myself. So, as I said, Howdy cited Arthur Smith as a real big influence, and all of the rags Arthur Smith wrote, I think, is one of the reasons that Howdy came up with this tune. I think we're up to stomps and breakdowns and reels. So these are just some fiddle tunes. Sort of one from the North Country that I've always really liked, and a lot of people to this day play that tune, but they tend to follow the Kenny Baker version. So if we could listen to both of those. So there's a maturity, you can hear the maturity in the phrasing, hear the little double stops, little tiny changes to the melody here and there that Baker introduces. Another Arthur Smith tune, Indian Creek, with versions by Howdy and Kenny, and you'll sort of hear a progression in stylistic maturity as we go down that list. So if we could play those, Lynn. Give you an idea of what a strong player he was, hopefully. Yeah.
So were these truly creative, or to some extent were they concocted for dancing, like a certain number of, repetitions, or?
So there's a very standard format to the tunes for dancing, and that's that there's 8 bars that get repeated, and then another 8 bars, and then those get repeated, and then the whole thing gets repeated all over again. So square dances, line dances, circle dances, contra dances, they all use that basic format. So when Arthur Smith is making up a tune, and if he wants it to be played for a dance, he's kind of restricted to that format. So it's basically a 32-bar format. 8, repeat, another 8 in the second part, but that gets repeated. So concocted versus composed, I don't know that there's a difference. But I think a lot of the compositions came about as because people were just playing together and just exchanging ideas, and that somebody would tend to remember and then sort of codify a particular tune.
So that was going to be my next question. When Arthur Smith, for example, created these things, was he enough of a musician, trained musician to write the notes down, or did
Yes.
somebody else?
Yes. He also copyrighted his stuff. And in the 1940s, I believe, he filed suit against a number of musicians who were recording his material. And they weren't doing it maliciously. They heard his songs and his tunes, and they just assumed that they were traditional public domain material because they were so good and they were so authentic sounding. But he went to court and he won. He won judgment. So, but that's a very good question. There was some savvy to his approach to music. He wasn't going to be taken advantage of. So let's listen to Indian Creek, or just Kenny Baker's version, I think. So see if you compare the Kenny and Howdy ones. It's phrasing, there's extra dynamics there. If you listen to Arthur Smith music, there's no dynamics. And why would that be, would you think? Well, my guess is that if you're playing to a radio audience, or if you're playing to a big concert, or if you're playing at an outdoor picnic, nobody cares about dynamics, which is playing loud, playing soft, playing in the medium, changing your phrasing a little bit. Nobody cares about that. They just want to hear the music. They feel the rhythm. Whereas when you're recording with modern recording equipment and people are playing the same song over and over again on their record player, or their CD player, or their MP streamer, you want to be able to hear some subtlety in the music. So as we progress into the modern age, music sort of develops this kind of rhythmic and dynamic maturity. So there was a whole bunch of waltzes that Arthur Smith was associated with. Paris Waltz, he's going to be playing it at a tempo that is fairly typical for waltzing. But when Kenny Baker gets a hold of it, and this is Kenny Baker and Howdy Forster, but I think it's only Kenny Baker on this particular track, you'll notice he slows it down significantly and makes more of just an instrumental piece. So we didn't quite get into the back part of that song. In the second part of the song, there's really only the place I can really think of in Arthur Smith's music where he goes in for a flourish, where he sort of takes the chains off and goes for it. But the Kenny Baker version is very full sounding, much slower, much more a listening piece as opposed to a dancing piece. So that's and Howdy's playing that harmony in the background, if you could hear that. Very common folk waltz, Green Valley Waltz. I don't know if this is an Arthur Smith composition or not, but it's an extremely common American tune. And so listen to Arthur and Chubby play this one. Slower than his Paris waltz, isn't it? But Chubby will pick up the tempo and make it more of a dance thing. So. So there's not just one way that this music evolved. So in one case, we went from quick to slow as we went into the modern era. In another, we went from slower to faster as we evolved a little bit. Now, I wanted to play a little bit of this beautiful waltz that Howdy Forster made up, called Memory Waltz, just because I didn't want to give him a short shrift on this. He wrote some beautiful tunes, and this is one of my favorites. Much more complicated melody than Arthur Smith. You know, for as much of an influence as Arthur Smith had on Howdy Forster, Howdy went beyond it, and he had the technical ability and the musical ability to make those extra steps. And so that's the best music of Howdy Forster is going to be some of his local, or rather not local, solo recordings that he made just when he was on his own, slightly overproduced, but not to the Nashville sound level of being overproduced, but not quite in the bluegrass vein either. But you can at least hear what a powerful musician he was, powerful fiddle player. Let's see. So, as I said, bluegrass music is really vocal music, and we've been concentrating on fiddle. So we've been concentrating on fiddle as with its role in the instrumental type of songs. So here we have some vocals, and what we're going to hear here in the first case is what I'd like you to listen for is the Dixie Liners are going to be doing "In the Pines" with. They're going to be singing it, but the background music, the background harmonic content, sort of static. Stanley Brothers, much more of an old-time high harmony sound. Andy did a very good job of describing that. And then the Bill Monroe version, if you compare it to the Stanley Brothers, I think what you'll hear is the aspects of bluegrass music, the uniqueness of bluegrass music that Bill Monroe brought to it. If you compare the Stanley Brothers' take on doing this song versus the Bill Monroe, you'll just hear there's more stylistic things going on, some extra interest. So if we could just go through those, Lynn.
Tell me, love, tell the longest train I ever saw went down that Georgia.
A lot of bluesier, a lot of these scooped vocally things. Pretty amazing. Picking a Pen, one of the most fun bluegrass songs ever written, wouldn't you say? I got a pig home and a pen, corn to feed him on. All right.
Got that big home and been going to feed him on. All I wanted to put a little girl to feed him when I'm gone. I got a big home and been going to feed him on. All I need to put a little girl to feed him when I'm gone.
So I'm glad that you could at least hear that little fiddle break there, because I just think it's great. And also you heard how much faster the Stanley Brothers did it. That's kind of they took the baton from Arthur Smith and said, you know, let's run with this. Let's speed these things up as much as we can. Pig in a Pen is an Arthur Smith song. You know, he wrote that one. It's one of the ones that he actually had copyrighted, and it's become a complete bluegrass standard, I would say. You know, just everybody does it. Maybe not high art exactly, but a fun song. A fun song.
Can I make a biased comment, a plug? I know Byron Berline. I know you mentioned, I think Arthur Smith played with the McGees, who were the Rolling Stones of the day. Byron played with the Rolling Stones. But he also performed here for Hudson Bluegrass. And Keith, who was our guitar instructor, he was playing bass with Byron that night. So it's online. In Poughkeepsie.
Vassar Clemens played with Jerry Garcia.
That's right. And they did Pig in a Pen.
I had a question about In the Pines. I always thought that was an old. Did he write that? Because
I'm not sure about that. I don't think that
Lead Belly did.
Yeah, I don't think that he did. But he performed it, you know, on the Grand Ole Opry in the 30s, and it was just one of those examples of a song that Arthur Smith did that became, even though he was not a bluegrass player, it was taken up by the bluegrass. I really, at the beginning, I really wanted to tell you that if you had any questions, to ask them, but you did, so that was good. Are there any questions now that you'd like to ask?
Just about your background, did you start out playing violin, like, you know, when you were a kid or something, and then?
No, I'm self-taught on the violin, which I don't recommend. It's, you know, made a lot of mistakes. It's a hard instrument. I played a number of instruments. It's the hardest. There's just no getting around it. And, but I didn't, although I taught myself, I didn't learn by myself. You know, I had a lot of friends who played. I was always listening to recordings over the years, and now that, you know, one thing I didn't have growing up obviously was the internet and YouTube. It's a lot easier now, I think. But you know, I helped teach a group of a local group of young musicians called the Strawberry Hill Fiddlers, and they are all classically trained, and they are all very fast learners. They all have the technique that you need to play this instrument well. And but my background is just as, you know, folk, pop music. I love jazz, I love blues, and just try to apply those to the violin. So it's, like I said, I wouldn't recommend it because it's so inefficient to teach yourself a difficult instrument. There's just things, if I learned right off the bat to do it this way versus do it that way. And if I learned to practice certain things and not try to play Byron Berline tunes, I would have been maybe better off. I would have learned a little more quickly. Yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay.
Well, you're very
So what limits your speed? Is it the left hand?
No, it's the right hand. You know, like It's if you notice what happens is, so let's say you're practicing a song, right? Let's say I'm practicing that song Roanoke. So I learn it like this. Or something, right? If you notice, I'm using about maybe 5 inches of bow. Well, if I tried to play the song that way, at that speed, using 5 inches of bow, my shoulder would fall off. So what you have to do to play faster, you either have to introduce slurs, which means I'm playing more than one note on a bow, or you have to take a lot of space out. In fact, I don't know if you could tell when I was playing that tune with Andy, I was using about a ½ inch of bow. So it's in the right hand, not the left hand. The right hand is the voice when you play the violin more than the left hand. So.
You sing when you play?
I can't sing when I don't play. So I went to Holy Trinity School at Poughkeepsie here, and I remember when I was in the first grade, Sister St. William had me stand up in front of the class and sing a Christmas carol, which I did all by myself. I had a beautiful angelic little voice. About 4 years later, I didn't understand what had happened to me, but my voice changed, and that was the end of my singing career. First grade, I was about that tall. So, yeah, it's a very rewarding instrument to play. There are few instruments that you can get such a range of sound out of. First of all, so there's that part of its variety. There's different kinds of sound you get out of it. But the other thing is that you can play so many styles of music on the violin and or the fiddle. And it doesn't have to be classical. And classical is one style. There are obviously many styles within the classical style, romantic and baroque and etc. But the violin is not usually thought of as a popular instrument, and yet there's Stefan Grappelli and Joe Venuti in the jazz area, and then you've got various blues players and rock players, and so many people in bluegrass, so many people in folk music, Irish, English, Scottish. I was in Cape Breton last week, incredible musicians playing fiddle. Dance seems to be at the core of all of it, though. It seems to be the violin and dancing seem to be associated with each other in a way that seems to be very strong.
Do you read these?
Barely. I mean, I can read, but it's halting, is how I would say it. In other words, some people you can put music in front of it and they can play it as if they were performing it. I can look at it and figure it out, but it's different than putting music in front of me and trying to read it. That's not a skill that I ever developed, sadly. I wish I had. But you sort of have to, take your choices as to what you're going to spend your time on it, and that wasn't it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.